Thank you, Amy. Welcome, everyone. As Zoom has no doubt notified you, we're recording this session. We've also enabled the live transcript for closed captioning. You may find that option on the control bar that's typically at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're extending the warmest welcome to the third ASLE Spotlight in this series on the topic of extinctions and extractions. I'm Sumita Chakraborty, and I'm a poet, essayist, and scholar. I'm the author of the poetry collection Arrow, which was published in 2020 by Alice James Books in the US and Carcanet Press in the UK. I'm working right now on a scholarly book called Grave Dangers, Poetics, and the Ethics of Death in the Anthropocene, which is under advanced contract with the University of Minnesota Press. I'm assistant professor of English and creative writing at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. For those of you joining an ASLE event for the first time, a very, very special welcome. We're so glad you've joined us today and invite you to help sustain and further our work by becoming an ASLE member if you are not already part of the association. Before we really get going, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands within and surrounding present-day Raleigh, where I work, are the traditional homelands and gathering places of many Indigenous peoples, including 8 federally and state-recognized tribes: Kory, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Haliwa Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, Saponi, and Waccamaw-Siouan. Further, as someone who teaches at a land-grant institution, I have to acknowledge that the Moral Act of 1862, which enabled the creation of such institutions, formalized the seizure and theft of native land by the United States government. We share an ongoing responsibility to safeguard these lands and to respect the sovereignty of the tribes and indigenous nations residing in North Carolina. ASLE's leadership launched this series in 2021 to elevate the work of our members in creative writing, scholarship, public engagement, and more. We're excited to continue to foster connections with new audiences through these spotlights. We'll ask that you remain on mute so that we can all hear the presenters' incredible spiels and the conversations to follow. We will have time, though, for questions later, and we'll ask you to use the chat to post your questions anytime. Please try to keep the questions concise since we only have these brief moments together. For now, let me introduce my co-host, Dominic O'Key, who will then introduce our 4 speakers today. Dominic is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of English at the University of Sheffield. He's the author of Creaturely Forms in Contemporary Literature, Narrating the War Against Animals, which was nominated for ASLE United Kingdom and Ireland's Book Prize. He is currently working on a new book titled The Conservation Plot. Take it away, Dominic.
Thanks, Sumita. Wonderful to be here. Thanks to Amy for putting this together, and to all our speakers today. And it's to them that we're going to be going over to now. They're each going to speak for 5 minutes, briefly introducing us to their exciting projects. And our first speaker will be Kate Rigby. Kate is Alexander von Humboldt Professor of Environmental Humanities and the Director of the Multidisciplinary Environmental Studies in the Humanities Research Hub at Cologne University. Her expertise within the environmental humanities lies primarily in environmental literary, historical, and religious studies. She is co-founder of the journal Philosophy, Activism, Nature. She's former co-editor of the University of Virginia Press's Under the Sign of Nature book series, and the author of many works, including Topographies of the Sacred, Dancing with Disaster, and Reclaiming Romanticism. She's also the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature, Environment and Culture, Australia, New Zealand. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you. So my latest book is kind of experimental. It's an endeavor to revitalize an ancient but largely forgotten genre of Christian literature that became known as the Hexameron. That is meditations on the biblical 6 hexa days hemera of creation in the creation narrative from Genesis 1 in the Christian Bible. It's obviously a Jewish text from the Hebrew scriptures originally. So this hexameral tradition flourished in late antiquity, around the 2nd to the 4th centuries, and it was revived in the Middle Ages, but it largely petered out in the 17th century, not coincidentally around the time of the Scientific Revolution. And there are also several verse hexamera, including in Book 7 of Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, what struck me was, among other things, that none of these earlier commentators took this text literalistically. They assume that nobody knows what it really means, and they identify different ways of interpreting it. For example, allegorical, analogical, moral, or what they call literal, by which they mean with reference to the natural world. And it's particularly this line of reading that interests me. And it commonly entailed a celebration of the earthly creation, and especially the extraordinary abundance and variety of living creatures. And these commentators are frequently in conversation with the natural philosophy of their time. And so mine also engages with contemporary knowledge systems, including Western natural sciences, but also indigenous epistemologies, ontologies, and ethics from the Americas and Australia. Several of the hexameral authors, several of these earlier hexamera take the form of homilies. They're actually delivered as homilies or sermons in the lead up to Easter week. And so I've also modeled mine along these lines. So each begins with a personal narrative, followed by an exegesis of the biblical passage, a contemporary recontextualization, launch into eco-political critique, and I end, as every good homily must, with words of encouragement. And this is drawn from my conversations with representatives from an array of faith-based environmental initiatives from around the world. And this is really what I want to bring to you today. So the slides show some of these. The first day, Amy, that's our first image, is of course a summoning of light from the watery deep, which graciously comes to alternate with abiding darkness. And I read this as an invitation to contemplation. This is where the whole thing starts. Attending to the apprehensible whilst honoring the incomprehensible. And of course, such contemplative practices can be found in many religious traditions, including Christianity, as recalled by Aidan Hart's beautiful icon of St. Cuthbert and the otters. And I see such contemplative practice as a necessary counterpart to sustained activist engagement. The second day, with the separation of earth and sky, I discuss in terms of the emergence of Earth's atmosphere, and I focus on the impacts of climate disruption in Australia and the Pacific region. And this is one of my interlocutors, Rabbi Jonathan Karen Black, who was the founding president of Green Faith Australia. And here he is blowing the Jewish shofar to sound the alarm and call for transformation. The third day, separation of land and sea, sees Earth's birthing of plants. Here I focus on the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, and this is Marcia Maria de Oliveira, who was a founding member of the Catholic organization REPAM, the Church in the Amazon, which works alongside Indigenous peoples to defend their land and culture against extractivist violence. The fourth day, with the creation of sun, moon, and stars, leads me to a focus on pollution, especially air and light pollution. And this is Reverend Ben Chavez of the United Churches of Christ in the US during a 1983 protest against the dumping of toxic waste. I didn't interview him, but I did interview the current UCC lead for environmental or creation justice. In fact, UCC launched the whole movement against environmental racism, and it continues to expose and protest the inequitable impacts of pollution in the US. The fifth day, the emergence of winged and finned creatures from the ocean, brings me to a focus on the degradation of wetlands and oceans. And the young woman in the middle here between the two fishermen is Queen Elizabeth Hare of Arusha, Kenya's marine conservation program. The sixth day, the emergence of land animals and the creation of human beings, leads me, of course, to a critique of human chauvinism which can actually be found, of course, within the hexameral tradition as well. Not universally, there are quite different emphases among the different contributors to this tradition, but within some of them, certainly, you can see that human chauvinism coming out. And so I focus here on the human mistreatment of other animals, both directly and indirectly through the destruction of their life worlds. And the image here is a book that explores resources for the ethical treatment of animals within the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It's written by Christina Nellis, who is a co-founder of the Pan-Orthodox Concern for Animals. And POCA, this organization, commissioned this beautiful icon of Christ breaking the bonds of animal suffering, as it's called. Now, the seventh day is generally not included in the hexameral tradition, and that's one of the problems with it, because, of course, the seventh day is crucial. The whole narrative culminates not with the creation of human beings, but with an invitation to join in festive celebration of what I call the communion of creatures, in anticipation not of the kingdom, but of the kingdom. And here it is imaged by the Australian artist Leonard French from his series, The 7 Days of Creation, from the mid-1960s. And this is what I use in the cover of the book. This is the seventh day when, as he puts it, all the days became one and everything was alive on the earth. So I guess really what I wanted to do was to revisit this tradition in the era of extinction, where we see not abundance and diversity, but diminution and loss and suffering, but to also find some kind of resources to keep our activist spirit fed and alive and able to engage and resist. Thanks, Amy. That's the end of my little spiel.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Next, we're going to hear from Kory Russel, who researches non-networked water and sanitation and is an assistant professor of landscape architecture and environmental science at the University of Oregon. Kory is the current chair of the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance and the co-founder of the Landscape for Humanity initiative at University of Oregon. Along with two Oregon graduate students, Björn Christensen and Audrey Reisowitz, he has an installation as part of the UO College of Design, UO College of Design at the Transspecies Design Exhibition in the 2023 Venice Architectural Biennale. And this is what he's going to be talking to us about right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, so really this piece was in large part a reaction to the number of species that are involved in our waste systems, right? So in many ways, we, as all human beings, non-human beings, plants, animals, we're all excreting waste to live, right? It's this universal aspect of life on Earth. The difference is that we as humans have not necessarily been great at reintroducing our waste into the world without causing a lot of damage. And that's fairly different than a lot of other species, which are very integrally tied and their waste is very useful. And so what this project was really looking to do was threefold. One was to look at all the sanitation processes necessary that necessarily involve other species who are often backgrounded or remain largely unexamined entities within the typical considerations, right? Typically, we think of water and sanitation, especially in an architectural or urban context, as being very systematic, very mechanical. This is just something that you operate. And in fact, it is integrally tied to other species, especially when it comes to the biological realm of bacteria and viruses and microscopic organisms. They're essential to our actually being able to treat that. On up to how our waste can affect macrofauna, you know, especially when we were in the lead up to the Olympics in Rio, we saw a lot of stories around how the bay in Rio was contaminated, right? And that is raw sewage going directly in and affecting the dolphins and different other organisms in addition to human health, right? So this is really an installation that was meant to get people to start thinking about that sort of thing. And so then the other aspect that we really wanted to bring out in contemplating this sort of thing, right? Because often whenever you talk about human waste, it's a very taboo subject, right? People don't want to talk about it. We all do it. Nobody wants to acknowledge that we do it, right? And so some of the things that we wanted people to think about is that the benefits of improved and sustainable sanitation are not confined to humans. There is huge benefits for humans and human health and all those sorts of things. But we should also be taking into account what the benefits to the environment and the diversity of other species that stand to benefit from more inclusive approaches to sanitation, and specifically how we could be designing urban spaces and our interaction with those species in a way that our waste is not detrimental, but in fact can be an advantage. And that really led to the third aspect of this, which was realizing the resources that are contained within human waste. The organic material, there's energy there, there's water there, there's nutrients there. There's all of these sorts of things. You can generate electricity, you can create biofuels, compost for farming and fertilizers. All of these things are wrapped up in that. And it's something that if we stop thinking of it as waste and started thinking of it more as a resource that needs to be refined, we start to change our relationship with that. And we can change our relationship of the city sort of being a blight on the landscape as more of an integrated into the landscape to help heal it and those sorts of things. So one final thing before I wrap up on this, I did want to acknowledge Bjorn and Audrey, who were integral in doing this work, and Bjorn specifically, who I believe is in this session as well, has done a lot of work. And so I would encourage you to check out anything that he's producing around sort of thinking beyond just human-centered systems that integrate animals and a number of other species. Thank you. And that last slide there, just to those are different resources that you can make in those bottles. Those are all different resources from waste. And these were part of the installation in Venice.
Thanks, Kory. It's fascinating. Next up is Beatrice Szymkowiak, who's a French-American writer and scholar. Beatrice graduated with an MFA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts in 2017, and later obtained a PhD in English creative writing from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2022. She's the author of Red Zone, published with Finishing Line Press in 2018, which is a poetry chapbook, as well as the winner of the 2017 Omnidawn Single Poem Broadside Contest, and the recipient of the 2022 Aga Shahid Ali Prize in Poetry for her full-length collection, Birds, published by the University of Utah Press last year. Her work has also appeared in Terrain and Portland Review, Omniverse, Southern Humanities Review, and many others. Take it away, Beatrice.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Oops. Sorry, it takes a minute. Yeah. Sorry. Try to start the slideshow. Yep. All right. Can everybody see? Okay. So the bird on the cover was drawn by 19th century naturalist John James Audubon for his iconic ornithological and archival work, Birds of America. However, as you see on the screen, the bird is here escaping the frame, disappearing from the sky, as like the roughly 3 billion birds that we have lost in North America since the 1970s, roughly a third of the birds. So a continuous narrative substance, Audubon's work, but also the bird loss that we are witnessing right now, and more widely, extinctions and climate change. It is a nature narrative that relies on a conception of nature separate from humankind. This nature narrative has served many hegemonic centrisms, has fostered ecologically damaging discourses, including the one of natural history. And natural history itself, was embedded in imperialism and settler colonialism. On the screen, you can see a specimen of a bird species which has been renamed after a naturalist settler and which was just declared extinct. So as a reminder, Audubon had racist views and owned slaves. He also killed the birds he drew. To make his sumptuous drawing, he used ropes and sticks to prop the lifeless birds as if puppets. Actually, if one closely read the text accompanying the drawing, Birds of America is just, it just resounds like a massacre. So on the screen, you can see the now extinct Carolina parakeets, which were drawn here by Audubon. You can see also an example of a bird taxidermy diorama. They were very popular in the 19th century and they're quite creepy. Birds, the poetry project, started with a process of lyrical erasure and reflection. The idea was to expose the disconnected approach to the more than human world, to also expose the discursive mechanisms of nature narratives embedded in language, and also to denounce, its logical ends and consequences. So my writing process started by considering Birds of America, the text, as an archival cage. Then I selectively erased the textual cage to reveal its ambiguity and the complex relationship between humanity and the more than human world. So you can see on the screen that example of Audubon's text, and what I did with it is one of the first poem of the collection, Around the Heavens. Around the Heavens introduce also the we in the collection, a we that will become very equivocal and spectral throughout the collection. So as the cage disappears, the bird escapes and their voices become entangled with ours in that, we. And I'm missing a slide there. I don't know what's up. Yeah. So I conceived Birds, the collection, as a new narrative, a narrative of enchantment. And I'm using here the term developed by Timothy Morton's, the enchantment as the exploration of the profound and wonderful openness and intimacy of the mesh. Timothy Morton's called the mesh all the entanglements of human beings and beings on Earth. So by enchanting, literally singing the readers back into the mesh, I was hoping with Birds to contribute to changing that narrative of extinction that as a separate event. And I wanted to foster an ecological awareness necessary to envision an ecological future. So that was, all what was subtended, the work behind Birds. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Beatrice. Finally, before we start our discussions, we'll move to Michael Tondre, who's an associate professor of English at Stony Brook University. Michael's the author of The Physics of Possibility, published with Virginia in 2018, and the book he's going to be and Oil, a different book than what he's going to be talking about today, because Oil being the object lessons book with Bloomsbury, and then Oil with the exclamation mark, of course, the introduction is written for the republication of Upton Sinclair's Oil. Michael has published in journals such as PMLA, ELH, Victorian Studies, Victorian Literature and Culture, and on and on and on. And his latest book project is titled Refinement: Oil, Literature, and the British Atlantic World, 1850 to 1930. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank the organizers, Amy, Sumita, and Dominic, and everyone in the audience today for being present. It's been a real pleasure to learn about people's work, and I'm really glad for this context. So I'll keep things relatively short so we can leave time for discussion and just talk a little bit about this volume and how I came by it. And so Upton Sinclair's 1927 novel Oil is, for many critics, the canonical petronovel, and the exception to the rule that oil hides in plain sight as the unconscious, taken for granted commodity of our era. Sinclair tries to map the entire commodity chain of hydrocarbon production and consumption with attention to emergent norms of an American good life enabled by crude, alongside a regime of sanctioned violence around the petroeconomy's new zones of sacrifice and state neglect. Coterminous with this project, the novel thematizes the regional rise of Southern California and shows how the petromagical sorcery of dirty oil dollars contributed to the refined surfaces of Hollywood and LA's asphalt spiderwebs, the nation's new educational and carceral systems, and its transformed geographies of work and domesticity. Essentially, the novel shows how modern oil capitalism forms the base structure for every elemental fact of industrialized life in a way that, to my mind, few other novels in the global north really have, and it remains a key document in imagining the blockages en route to an alternative energy mix now. Its iconic exclamation mark, which Dominic was talking about a second ago, in particular speaks to the extreme emotions that oil generates and the urgent geopolitical project now of transitioning to alternative fuels. Up until now, the novel's only been available as a reprint of its 1927 single volume edition without any kind of critical apparatus, and is probably best known for general audiences as the basis for There Will Be Blood, the Paul Thomas Anderson film from 2007. For this reason, I was really excited to learn that the novel was going out of copyright in 2023 and got to work on this volume with Penguin for what I believe is the first modern critical edition of this key text. In the introduction, I present the novel as a touchstone in Anthropocene discourse generally, and the energy humanities in particular, with attention to lots of brilliant work on the novel by Stephanie Lemenager, Amitav Ghosh, Graham MacDonald, Heidi Scott, and others. And so I kind of go through the novel's initial publication record a bit and talk about how its textual history, I think, is really important in a way that hasn't been done before, since there hasn't been a modern edition. And one thing I found is just that there was a ton of changes that Sinclair made between the novel's initial installment print run in the Daily Worker, the newspaper for the Communist Party of America, and then its single volume edition that came out subsequently. So about 80 changes that he made to the text. Many had to do with the technology of refinement itself and the question of how crude gets cooked from its initial raw state to become a more human matter of concern in the novel. But most surprisingly, I found that Sinclair changed the very title of the novel itself in one key way. In its initial run, oil appeared as just plain oil without the exclamation mark. Sinclair eventually added the mark in the last stages of the book's run up to publication in order to skirt copyright, essentially, for another novel called Oil that came out in 1924. So the insertion of the exclamation mark, to my mind, offers a perfect encapsulation both of the novel's core subject and its formal method. At the level of subject matter, the mark represents the iconography of the gusher or blowout, in the sense that it kind of literally looks like an oil blowout. And we see how, as Sinclair describes throughout the novel, oil kind of bursts to the surface with otherworldly force, as in a passage where the narrator describes, quote, a tower of flame in which, quote, the burning oil would hit the ground and bounce up and explode and leap again and fall, end quote. And then at the level of method, the mark speaks, I think, more centrally to Sinclair's understanding that oil is a historically contingent object of cultural production. It illustrates his belief that oil isn't just a set of entrenched commodity relations, but also a wider nexus of emotional, expressive, and imaginative relations that might be reconstituted through literary and cultural acts of improvisation. From the fractionated modes of work and domesticity we still inhabit, to the Petro-era's correlated systems of movement, consumerism, military power, and virtual communication, in order to spur another energy era that still has no name. And so that's the novel, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michael. That's wonderful stuff. What we're going to be doing now is, I think I will hand over to Sumita, who's going to ask a question to all of our speakers. Once we've taken a round of answers, then I might ask my own question. And then after that, we'll go to the audience. So, Sumita.
Thank you, Dominic. And let me also take this opportunity to remind all of you, if you do have questions, please do feel welcome to put them in the chat anytime. We'll be excited to save some time for them at the very end. So I think when Dominic and I were reading all your materials, and actually before I start, I should thank you all very much for those fascinating presentations. It was a delight to listen to and a delight to prepare to for today. I think when we were preparing for today, Dominic and I both found ourselves really interested in the question of scale. So in various ways, both of our questions speak to the scales on which your projects operate. And I'd like to start with perhaps the scale of the intimate or the personal. I was struck, although you didn't speak about those in your 5-minute spiels for the most part, I was struck when reading your materials in advance that many of you had an investment, a personal investment that brought you to the subject or guided you through the subject of your exploration. There's also, even in something like waste, a kind of investment in the idea of intimacy, the intimacy of co-dwelling with one another, the intimacy of the way that we exist in this time of extinction and extraction. So I would love to hear from all of you who'd like to reflect on it. What personal investments or what more intimate investments drive your project? or lead you through them, and how you're thinking of personally inhabiting the subjects about which you write or design. And perhaps the easiest way to do this logistically, maybe I could just go through each of you one by one in the same order in which you spoke. Would that make sense? So then, Kate, would you like to start?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Oh gosh, it's hard to know where to start, really. There is a kind of lyrical, even autobiographical element that traces through my book, and this is the book I would say that has been closest to my heart. I think for a couple of reasons. One, because I have actually tried to kind of pull back a bit from the scholarly. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I'm trying in this book to reach a kind of more than academic readership, a non-specialist readership. And in particular, I guess I'm trying to speak to people who might have a kind of reductive sense of Christian engagement with questions about human relations with the modern human world, both Christians themselves, but also non-Christians. I don't know that people who don't have an interest in Christianity will want to read this book, but I kind of hope they might. But I'm particularly wanting to sort of show to people who do come from a kind of Christian background that there's this really rich tradition of celebrating the more than human world. It's not an unproblematic tradition, and we need to engage with it sort of critically, but it's there all along. So a kind of ecological concern is not something that is in any sense kind of remote to Christianity if you look back at this tradition. The other aspect of kind of intimate involvement, I mean, this is my this is my heritage. I was raised in a C of E sort of left-leaning C of E kind of family, so it's my kind of cultural background. But the other thing that is I suppose really pressing for me is just a profound delight and sense of wonderment and enchantment. Beatrice, you used that term in Tim's usage of it. And I find that in this tradition, and of course that comes with huge sorrow. I mean, it was really written out a great deal of sorrow, and also sense of injustice. So I think I really hate the word extinction, because it's so neutral and cold, and it masks the absolutely unspeakable suffering that individuals and communities are experiencing as their life worlds unravel, human and non-human communities and multi-species communities. It's that suffering is completely masked, and the injustice of it just I find appalling. So yeah, I do. This is a book that does really cut close to the bone for me more than anything else I've written.
Thank you very much, Kate. Kory?
Yeah, I think the intimate aspect of waste and using sanitation facilities is pretty apparent to most people. I am not somebody who I think that most people, whether it's the different taboos that our societies and communities has shaped in many ways what technologies we allow to be used, regardless of what the impacts are on the environment and what could be done more efficiently, right? Like if you think of the flush toilet, ultimately we're taking some of the cleanest water that has been processed, turned into drinking water, and then we're putting feces in it. And then we're extracting that again before we can put it out into the environment. And on its face, it's absolutely absurd when we actually think it through. However, that's the way we do it, right? Like that's the gold standard the globe over, even though only 40% of people have that. But the other portion of the world is striving towards flush sanitation, water-based sanitation, and it's wildly inefficient and damaging to the environment. But trying to change it is really something that revolves around that intimate taboo of what is our cultural norm for how we do it. And there are many different cultural norms around the world, right? To say the sitting flush toilet is the only thing is completely wrong, right? They're squatting, they're washing, wiping, all these different things. But ultimately, there's these intimate understandings of what is sanitary, what is clean, what is appropriate that dominate this space. And so for me, it's a really interesting aspect because, my background is engineering, and in engineering, it's very straightforward, right? We've got a process, we're going to figure this out. And that doesn't matter when you really go to implement these sorts of things. And so, and to speak to sort of the extraction aspect of this session, I think one of the interesting things is that we do very extractive processes to create fertilizers, to create agriculture that we could be harnessing what we're throwing away, right? When we think about extraction, why is extraction of the resources from our waste not a priority that we're already collecting, we're already centralizing? It's just that there are, again, those taboos, that intimacy with it is sort of a way of distancing from sort of a future that could be far more sustainable for not only humans, but the natural world as well.
Thank you very much, Kory. Beatrice?
Yes, so as a poet, as a writer, I'm always interested in language. And language has also participated in developing, that myth of the separation between humankind and the more than human. It has also been used to justify our human exceptional. Oh, that's one of those words, exceptionalism. So I was very interested in using language in a different way that could bring us back as an ecological being, as a being amongst the earth. So I really wanted through the poetry, I wanted the reader to experience that belonging, that attunement to the entangled web of lives that we are part of too. With also the sorrow, as Kate was saying, the joy also, with the also all our waste. So I wanted really to bring that intimacy back into the language, and that is why I was like, at the beginning, I wasn't sure of how to go about it, and which pronoun to use, what could be an ecological pronoun that would bring us together. And I chose to use the we as an experiment, if you wish. And I knew when if you read the book, there is a little prose piece at the beginning trying to show that yes, I'm using the we. I'm also aware of his fallacies and his assumptions that it can bring. So I wanted to experiment with that and to use the we as a way to bring us back into that intimacy of life. And what I did also along with the we is I scaled down all the markers of avian bodies, of bird bodies, as as a way to just throughout the collection just bring more entanglement between the birds and the humans, the we. It's at the end I feel that, and I hope that we don't know exactly who is speaking anymore.
Thank you, Beatrice. Michael.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think, like my co-panelists, I'm interested in the imminently recursive nature of the systems of ecological derangement that folks are describing. I think particularly for Sinclair in the writing of the novel Oil, there's an interesting history in which he himself was bound up in the scramble that he describes. In 1921, the Shell cartel kicked off a massive scramble outside of LA in Kern County. And at that moment, Sinclair's partner, Mary Kimbo, bought 2 land lots and began to think about selling them, just as Sinclair himself, began to imagine this novel Oil. And so, interestingly, right as he writes the words "the end," 10 months later, Kimbrough cashed in on her land, and so in a sort of strangely literal sense, he creates an oil product for profit, as does his partner, and finds himself ambivalent about this new regime of oil capitalism as it comes online in Southern California. So I think that one interesting aspect of the novel is that it's a problem that he can never objectively describe in full, so much as iteratively, let's say, perform in the sense of dramatizing his own toxic attachment to oil. And so it's a kind of ideological impasse, the question of how to hate oil more properly, I suppose, that never gets resolved at the level of plot, but gets repeatedly raised as a question for the narrative itself. And so it's something that Sinclair is trying to map in the narrative at hand.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks again to all of you for those incredibly rich responses. There's a lot to think about there. I'm going to hand it back now to Dominic to ask his question.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like actually the responses have all sort of taken what I'd planned and already answered it. But that's all good, because I've got another question lined up, which is to change track slightly. I wonder how working on these distinct projects, how they have each changed the way that you think about the environmental humanities, broadly conceived. Whether you because I'm aware, some of these projects are more scholarly than others, some are very creative, they have all of these different facets to them. But at the end of the day, as scholars or thinkers within the environmental humanities, I'm interested in how these particular projects, the labors that they required of you, the thinking that they required, and also their reception, now that they're finished, whether that has made you think any differently about the affordances, for example, of the environmental humanities. Maybe we go in the same order.
Thanks. Yes, another great question. So first of all, I think one of the things that that inspired me to seek to revitalize this genre is that I realized that the hexameron as a literary genre, it connects science or empirical observation, religion, ethics, and aesthetics in a way that I think we need to kind of re-embrace after those things have been kind of torn apart. So that's part of it. And the other thing for me, I guess one of my objectives with the book and perhaps in some of my other writings as well, is in a sense to kind of bring religion and religious studies in from the cold in environmental humanities. I feel that the environmental humanities, as they've kind of developed over the last couple of decades, have really been dominated by the secularist bias of scholars in the global north. And particularly doing the field work that I did, the interviews that I did with people, Latin America, India, Africa, work I've done also in the Pacific. The fact is that for the overwhelming majority of people in the global south, religion is really important. And so to engage with people in terms of where they're coming from their faith perspectives seems to me quite important in terms of kind of decolonizing the environmental humanities, making it less global north centric. So that was, I suppose, something that I kind of came into focus as I was working on the book.
Sorry, I totally forgot where I was. The thing I would say that I think, myself coming from a much more, engineering sciencey background, typically when we're talking about these topics of waste and sanitation, it often is in fairly cold statistical terms. The research is very it's numbers oriented, right? Which in many ways obscures the human cost and the environmental cost of not engaging and ignoring these sorts of issues. And I think one of the beauties of art and humanities and design is that it can soften people's preconceived notions to accept a different way of thinking about things that otherwise they wouldn't even engage with, right? I have a very specific way of thinking about this, and through the humanities and art and design, there's a way of sort of softening that, and maybe somebody considers something and that opens something up to think about it in a different way, in a new way, that sort of thing. So I think in engaging with this topic and especially, working with Bjorn to consider the non-human actors within the system, that is just so rarely, if ever, considered within our waste systems and our urban environments, right? Usually animals are a problem that need to be exterminated, not the other way around of, well, they're reliant on these systems we've created, and we've created an entire environment in which they cohabitate with us. How do we engage that in a way that's productive? I think that opened a lot of new routes of thinking for me. Yeah.
So that's, I was just listening, so I was still processing, sorry. So with Bird, what I wanted, and with all my projects of poetry and eco poetry, what I wanted maybe to demonstrate somehow is like that language informs our engagement with the more than human world, and that reversely, our interactions with the world and the more than human world, that our interaction also with the environment transform, language, and that, the language we speak matters, and the stories we tell also matters. And so I hope, through my work to put back language, in the discussion about, environment, because I think, especially I was thinking of why, I had, such, reflection behind the pronoun, is because pronoun matters. And we've seen, and I'm talking about the English. We have the she and the he and the they and the it. And so already embedded in those pronouns, we have already a separation with the more than human world. So how can we rethink language and the way we speak to transform our engagement, with the environment? I think it's, where my work is, located.
And I think for my part, one thing I discovered through the development of the addition oil is just simply like the material and discursive specificity of energy in cultural production, and the what happens, how reading from an energy conscious vantage makes new histories and forms of knowledge available in ways that might have been nascent or obscure to the authors in question. So for instance, Sinclair was, I think, inchoately groping towards a sort of account of energy systems in each of his major novels, The Jungle, about industrial food production, 1907, and then King Coal after that, and then finally oil. And we see him kind of rehearsing a sort of a system of energy and work, which is increasingly carbon intensive in nature. And he himself might not have, I think, understood to himself that that was what he was up to. But I think in historical hindsight, through a more self-conscious vantage, becomes available as a project that is meaningful in our moment.
Yeah, exactly. So we have the sort of the cheap food, cheap coal, cheap oil. Move over, Jason W. Moore. We've already got it 100 years ago.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Do we have any final thoughts or questions from the audience? Otherwise, we are approaching the hour.
While we wait, maybe to see if anyone has a last question or a thought, I might read aloud Bart's comment, because that might be of interest to many people, even people who might be reviewing the recording. The proposal deadline for ASLE's 2024 symposium, Green Fire, Energy Stories Beyond Extraction, has been extended. It's now next Friday, February the 2nd. If you were interested in today, which I hope you were, you will likely be interested in that. So please feel welcome to take a look. I'll stall here for just a little bit. It looks like the conversation in the chat has been delightful, but doesn't contain a question at this time.
I've been trying to figure out how to raise my hand with Zoom, and I can't figure it out in this version, so I'm just raising my actual hand. I just wanted to say thanks to the panelists. That was so interesting. And I feel like I'm sort of inventing as I teach an introduction to the environmental humanities course that is a new part of our program. And a student said to me yesterday that it was very hard to think about everything all at once, and she wasn't sure how, like, what are we supposed to do with this? I mean, to be fair, we've read like a bunch of introductions to the field where it's like, here's all the things in the field. And then we read William Cronin's essay on different versions of nature. And then we read, a chapter on the Anthropocene to say, here's how the problem has changed from one of nature to one of the Anthropocene. The rest of the course will be more focused, but I was thinking that there is kind of a structural problem. There's so many structural problems, but one of them is that this field is trying to think about, as everyone says, giant systems and also really intimate things at the same time. Meanwhile, the students, and I think increasingly myself, are having even more trouble with, like, how do I start this project? I don't know how to break it down into steps, or I don't know, or like, how do I prioritize what to do and what to focus on? And what am I missing if I take some time to do this? And can I maybe just like keep track of all these other things while I'm also working on this one thing that I'm supposed to be working on? So we could have a much longer conversation about different ways that people are thinking about that problem of like how to organize mental energy, and how to, like, I think it's so great that ASLE will have these things where you have these so different projects that are all sort of related somehow, but if you had to articulate it, I think your title was great for that. And I think it requires the kind of contemplative time that Kate is kind of suggesting we need time for, to just like be okay with the fact that all these things are happening and we're not sure where to put ourselves. Anyway, so it's really just more of a comment, but I just really appreciate the creativity of everyone's individual work and also kind of the difficulty of putting them together as, I think, a challenge that is productive. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Anne. That's very, very true. And I do think that unites a lot of our interests and a lot of the panelists' interests today. That brings us to 2 p.m. So let me just finish by thanking Dominic, by thanking Amy, and of course by thanking the panelists, Kate, Kory, Beatrice, and Michael. It's been a true delight to speak with you. To be continued, I'm sure. Take good care, everyone.